In this video, I want to discuss some of the challenges that surround servicing these early 1970s to mid 1990s Mercedes-Benz transmissions. Primarily, changing the filter and changing the fluid. Now you can see here I've pulled the pan on this late 80s automatic and I've drained the fluid out. I always like draining the fluid out and leaving it overnight because you can't believe how much drips down. I've done some other videos on this. But how do you get all the fluid out of the transmission before you put the new fluid in? If you just drain the pan, there's fluid in the torque converters up here. Everybody says, oh yeah, you got to pull that plug and drain the torque converter. Well, let me tell you, even that's not enough because you have quite a bit of fluid in the valve body right here. You can't take the valve body down and drain it. That's too much work. And you've also got quite a bit of fluid up in the transmission cooler up at the radiator. So how do you get all this fluid out? You've got an old transmission that's probably had sporadic filter changes over the years, but has probably never had all the fluid cycled out of the transmission. And that's what I'm going to do on this car. I want to cycle all the fluid out, including anything that's in the torque converter and anything that's in the lines going up to the cooler and out of the bottom of the cooler. So how do I do that? First, I want to show you the fluid that came out of this transmission by dropping the pan and letting this all drain overnight. I drained the fluid into this large pan so we could get a clear view of its color. When I pull the dipstick on this, I said, wow, this transmission fluid is clean. And I do know that this car got a transmission fluid and filter change a few years ago and probably been driven less than 5,000 miles. This is a collector car, it doesn't get driven a lot. And when I started draining the fluid, I thought, well, maybe I'm wasting my time here. Look at this. Look how clean this is. And it doesn't have any bad smell to it. Like I said, hey, I'm wasting my time doing a fluid and filter change on this car, but not knowing the history or how this was done. Now that's the key point here. How was the fluid and filter changed? And who did it? And how thorough was it? So I'm going to show you the pan. Now this gives me a clue right here. We're going to bring the pan in here. And look at this. Look how dirty this is. Now I'm going to take this pan up on the bench here in a little bit, and we're going to take a real close look at this. Obviously, whoever did this cleaned the pan before he put it back on. But I also looked at the top of the filter, and look at that. Look at that crud that's on the top of the filter. So what do you think this tells us? I think it tells me that the fluid wasn't thoroughly drained, so there was old fluid in there. Obviously, it's better than nothing by just changing half the fluid, and I know a lot of people do that. But on these old cars that have been around for years, you want to do a thorough draining. Very important for the longevity of these automatics, and they are not cheap to replace or repair. Let's try to analyze what's in the bottom of the pan. I don't see any chunks of metal. I don't see any silvery spots of metallic. It's just this old gray sludge that commonly gets built up in these transmissions due to clutch pack wear and possibly some minor gear wear. I'm going to kind of brush all this to one corner, and then I'm going to use a magnet to see if this has any ferrous metal in it. Look at that. Okay, where did all this come from? Well, I have a hunch, sitting in the valve body, maybe in the lines up in the cooler. Now I'm going to bring in a magnet. Now, I'm a firm believer in using magnets in these transmissions. Mercedes started using these magnets here in the 7.2 2.9 transmission. You can't believe a couple of pans I pulled off those transmissions. This thing is about twice as thick as that with all this crud attached to it. So let's put this down in here. It's going to be kind of hard because I really need to let this sit overnight, but maybe Can't even hardly get it out of the pan. Ah, come on. Okay, we have some stuff forming on this magnet, as you can see. And I have a hunch if I left this overnight and drained in the corner like this, you would see the magnet picking up some of these very, very fine particles. What these magnets actually do is they prolong the efficiency in the life of the filter. I know you're saying, well, Kent, why worry about all this because it's going to be filtered before it goes back up into the transmission. But if you can collect a lot of this on a magnet, then it's not going to end up in the filter, and it will prolong the life of the filter. And I'm sure that's what the Mercedes engineers figured out with the advent of the 722.9 transmission. Around 2010, they had to actually enlarge the pan, increase the size of the filter, because they wanted to maintain better flow through the transmission. It was 2 days ago that I pulled the pan and the filter, and I pulled that drain pan away, and just in the last half hour, look at the drips I'm getting. So I thought I'd just leave this overnight. We'll come back tomorrow and see how much more fluid will actually drain out of that valve body. I'm also going to let the pan sit at a slope like this overnight and see what that magnet will pick up when we come back tomorrow. So I'm back here at the shop the next day. As you recall, I said I'm going to let this drip overnight. Look at that. Look at how much dripped overnight on the third day. So I've actually gotten almost a quart out of the valve body by letting it drip for 3 days. You're going to hear these instructions on the internet say, oh, just, drain the transmission, pull the filter, drain the torque converter, and refill. Okay, I disagree. You can see here, just by leaving the pan tilted overnight, it almost cleans itself. And that's what I do. When I'm letting the valve body drain, I lean this up against a drip pan and just let this drain out overnight. It saves cleaning. I've got the magnet down here. Let's see if it's picked up any ferrous materials. You can see how dark that is. But at least there's no chunks of metal. Well, look at that. Look at how much stuff, just having this sit in the fluid overnight, it picked up all this junk and attached it right to the magnet. So this right here, folks, is why I believe strongly in putting magnets in these older transmissions when you're doing your fluid and filter service. Not counting the fluid that's still dripping out of the valve body, which I just showed you. This is what I've been able to get out of the transmission so far. This is about 5.5 quarts, maybe a little over 5.5 quarts. And if I had not let it drain for those 2 days, this would have been down to about here, almost a quart, maybe 3/4 of a quart came out of the valve body by letting it drip for 2 days. Now the fill capacity is between 8 and 9 quarts. I'm just going to pour a little fluid in there to show you how clean this fluid is. Look at that. You could almost reuse this. But you got to see how dirty the pan was. So I'm going to stand by what I said earlier, is I think the person that did this fluid service previously did not drain all the fluid out. So where are those other 3 quarts anyway? I know there's probably a half a cup still in the valve body, but a good portion of that, maybe a little over a quart, is in the torque converter. And on these cars there is a plug that you can remove to drain the torque converter, but that doesn't get all the fluid out of the torque converter. Probably gets most of it, but you got the surface friction of all the components inside the torque converter that are holding fluid, unless you let that drain for 2 or 3 days. Then over here, come forward, we have what, and this varies on different models, where the actual transmission cooler is located, but you have lines coming from the transmission to the cooler, and you have lines going back, so that's probably where the other quart the 1.5 quart is. You know, I can drain the torque converter, but I'm not going to do that. But how am I going to drain the transmission cooler? That's hardly ever done. I don't think I've seen anybody talk about, hey, let's open up the lines. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to clean this up. I'm going to put a new filter in right here. I'm going to put a new gasket on the pan. I'm going to torque it down properly. And I'm going to fill the transmission with 5 quarts. Now here's where you come in. I want you to guess how I'm going to get all the rest of the fluid out of this transmission.